Welcome to week 4 of Phil 100 Introduction to Philosophy. This week we're going to transition from a more abstract, theoretical, or quote unquote philosophical discussion about epistemology in the meditations to a more practical approach to the same subject. And we'll see that the outlines that Descartes delimits of a basic epistemic dilemma are in fact the outlines of the epistemic situation that all creatures find themselves in that are consumers of information. I'll talk about two main threads that I think emerge in Descartes' discussion in the Meditations and that define a sort of universal epistemic context. So every organism that traffics in information, that tries to adapt to the world by gathering information and utilizing it in adaptive responses to their environment, has to first locate sources of information. Where can I get information? When you locate those sources of information, you also have to determine their calibration. That is, how reliable are these sources? What kinds of information do they provide me? And in what quantities? And as we'll see, these are constants in any epistemic context. You have to be able to answer these questions, figure out where information can be found, figure out how robust your sources are, the kinds of information that they can provide you with, and their overall reliability. Once we have these general outlines of a universal epistemic context, we'll turn our attention to the wider context of living organisms. And we'll start talking about an information imperative. What is an information imperative? Well, what I suggest in the lecture and the chapter is that when you look at life, one of the things that you come to realize is that life really needs information to thrive, often just to survive, but definitely to thrive. I'll give you a couple of examples of organisms that have this information imperative: phototropism in plants and geotropism in magnetotactic bacteria. Then we'll look at and hopefully answer what it is about human beings that make them unique. How did human beings go from almost being extinct to being one of the dominant life forms on the planet? And I'll suggest to you that it is their abilities with regard to the information imperative that make them unique. But it's not their ability to gather information per se. It's their ability to develop and utilize what I call information ecosystems. We'll talk about what an information ecosystem is. I'll give you a definition. In fact, I'll give you two different kinds of definitions of information ecosystems. And then I'll finish off this first part of the ecosystem lecture by briefly recapping the history of ecosystem evolution throughout the evolution of life that is in the chapter but is not assigned reading. So if you go back and you think about what Descartes was trying to do in the Meditations, one of the things you notice is that Descartes defines this epistemic situation, which I characterized the way that many philosophers have characterized it, as a Cartesian theater. That is, your sources of information are your ideas, the modifications of your own mind, and your judgments, your cognition thereon. that's the only conduit of information flowing into you from the external world. In order to evaluate the kinds of information and the quality of information and the reliability of those conduits, you have to actually decide what the calibration is of the various channels of information that you identify as the sources of your ideas and your judgments or operations thereupon. And this is exactly what Descartes does. Descartes sees his proof of the existence of God as a means of determining the sorts of information that he can gather from his ideas through his judgments, as well as when his judgments fail to meet his epistemic standard, his principle of justification, that he only assent to judgments that are clear and distinct, that are certain. Now, you might be tempted to suppose that this project is too philosophical or too extreme to have any interesting relationship to your everyday concerns. And certainly Descartes' justification principle is, in fact, pretty extreme. The idea that we can only really believe things that we are absolutely certain about is a principle that looks pretty unpracticable in the real world. However, stepping away from the specific proposals that Descartes forwards in the Meditations as to the sources and the calibration of those sources in his epistemic situation, we see that his epistemic dilemma is really just an instance of the universal epistemic dilemma, that anytime an agent, a life form, traffics in information, gathers information from the environment to utilize it as an adaptive response, that it has to have solutions to, whether they are explicitly believed or whether they're just built into its operations. It has to have solutions to these two questions. What are my sources of information, and how well calibrated are my sources? And the extent to which an organism fails to answer these questions is the extent to which it is epistemically at risk.